just this morning, the CFIB testified that their members, and their members would be, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of workers and businesses, are calling upon the government to have a time frame and lay out a plan for a balanced budget. Now, I've asked you this question literally dozens of times at this committee and at Committee of the Whole. I asked you last week at Committee of the Whole. You refused to answer this question. So I really hope that today might finally be the day that you can tell Canadians, because they're demanding this, in what year will your government balance the budget?
Well, let me talk a bit first about the CFIB. I saw them, and I want to thank them for they do important work, and we work very well with Dan Kelly and his team. I've answered, like you said, that question. Canada has the strongest fiscal position of the G7, and I think what Canadian will be pleased to hear is that yesterday, again, the OECD has said that we'd have the second fastest growth in the G7, and I can quote you the numbers if you want. That might be helpful.
No, if you're not going to answer the question, again, not answer the question, then we'll move on to another question, since you still refuse, despite being the Minister of Finance, who ought to have some kind of plan. This was a promise. You know, you ran in 2015. You promised a balanced budget following generational investment in infrastructure. The investment didn't happen. The infrastructure didn't get built. 10 years later, you promised the same thing. You don't deliver. You didn't balance the budget, and you refuse to even answer or even respond to any questions about a balanced budget. So let me ask you and bring to your attention this morning's PBO report. The PBO said, and we just got this was tabled just before you arrived here. I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, but I got to page 13 where it says, we estimate that the likelihood that the deficit to GDP ratio will decline in every year over 2026 to 27 to 2030, 31 is less than 1%. So, Minister, you have cut loose every fiscal anchor that your government has ever subscribed to, given itself, and now the PBO says you have a 1% chance of meeting your new fiscal anchor. What credibility do you think you have on any fiscal matter?
Madam Chair, this is a serious moment. I think Canadians understand that, and that's why you need to focus on facts and figures. And that's why, like I said, Madam Chair, as I was trying to explain, and Canadians who are watching understand the dynamic in this committee this morning. But what they want to know is that the Canadian economy is resilient, that what we have seen is an increase in business investment in machinery and equipment, an increase of business investment in intellectual property, a decrease in government spending, and again, someone who doesn't need a clip, perhaps like my colleague, the International Monetary Fund. They don't need a clip. They don't need a clip. They said Canada has the strongest fiscal position of the G7. The OECD, which is also an international body, just said we will have the second fastest growth in the G7. Those are the facts. Those are the numbers, Madam Chair.
Minister, you had an opening statement to make and run your clock. I'd like you to actually answer a question. You did not answer my question about credibility around your fiscal anchor, which has been challenged quite vigorously this morning by the PBO. The PBO says there is less than a 1% chance that your deficit to GDP ratio will decline. Less than 1%. Do you agree with the PBO's assessment, yes or no?
I'm sure. I think Canadians are very smart. They understand that we're facing one of the most uncertain period since probably the Second World War, that the world is complex and volatile. But despite all that, that Canada's
you had a chance to make an opening statement. Now you're here to answer questions.
Assessed by international agency as being the second fastest in the G7.
No, you're here to answer questions. You can say whatever you want in your opening statement. Answer. Why do you refuse to answer questions put to you by parliamentarians? Parliamentarians are elected to question ministers and hold them to account. Why do you hold them in such contempt?
Madam Chair, I've answered all the questions. That's a subjective comment by the member. He may not like my answer because the Conservatives don't really like when we present facts. That's the problem. And I've seen that over a decade
PBO,
where
yes
they don't
or no,
like facts, Madam Chair. That's what I present facts that they don't like it.
I asked you if you agreed with the PBO,
yes.
I asked you if you agreed with the PBO, and you talked about something completely different. That's not an answer. It may be a response. It's words. You say words at committee, but that's not an answer. So will you answer the question? Your credibility has been challenged by the PBO. Do you agree with the PBO's assessment, yes or no?
Madam Chair, I will even cite.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the time that we have. Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I asked the Bank of Canada governor, officials of your department, the PBO, and you, in fact, last week for the cost of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I couldn't get straight answers. You referred me to the total interest charge of all Canadian debt, and it was $58 billion. And you expected me to say that, to share that number with my constituents and say, figure it out. Figure out what is the actual cost for the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So I'd like to ask you again, how much is the interest cost for the $25 billion you're going to be borrowing for the Sovereign Wealth Fund? Just a number, please.
Well, thank you very much. And I recall your questions. You did ask me a few questions, but my answer will be the same. I would refer you to the main estimates and what has been provided there. You will see, and I can even quote you the pages where you can see the information,
I'd like the
which
number,
is
not the
relevant.
page. Just the number, not the page.
Well, like I said, this is all in the spring economic update. You will see the details with respect
That
to
is
the
just
sovereign
a
wealth
pool
fund.
of funds, not the actual number.
Like I said, all the information are there in an aggregate fashion.
Do you know the number of the cost of interest?
Like I said, Madam Chair, I'm quite happy to talk about the sovereign fund, and like I've answered my colleagues before, the data is included, in fact, in the spring economic update. And
Minister, we are in a recession. And now this morning's PBO report even forecasts that the GDP growth will be lower than expected, lower than even the OECD had projected. As the economy worsens, Canadians will be paying for this interest, and they want to know how much they're on the hook for. So how much is the interest that they will have to pay on the $25 billion of debt?
like I said, Madam Chair, I would refer to the OECD numbers that were published yesterday, which would say that Canada will have the second fastest growth
I'm asking
in
about
the
the interest,
G7.
the interest cost, Minister.
And with respect to the interest cost, like I said, I'd refer my colleague to table A19 on page 125 of the English version. She will find all the
Minister,
relevant information that has been
With all
made
due
public.
respect, you're refusing to state the number. However, your department actually just provided it on May 7th. Canadians will be on the hook for $750 million per year just on interest payments. Why are you withholding this number from Canadians?
Madam Chair, the member just stated a number which she say is public, so I'm not understanding the gist of the question. What I can say, Madam Chair, is that this is going to be transformational.
No,
and you have to
Minister,
look not only
I asked you for
at
the
the cost,
number
but you look at
several-
the benefit that is going to be
Excuse me,
provided to
Minister,
Canadians.
I asked you for the number several times. You refused to tell me last week. I'm giving you another chance now. You're still refusing to tell me. That's withholding the information. You know the number. It's $750 million per year. Now, you promised Canadians actually to reduce the deficit to GDP ratio after giving up the last fiscal anchor that didn't work for your political agenda. But now the PBO confirms that there's only a 1% chance that you will hit that deficit to GDP ratio. $750 million for the Sovereign Wealth Fund is just the interest for the debt. How much will the bureaucracy cost?
Madam Chair, let me quote a former PBO because I think it's important for Canadians to, and I quote, "The hard target of balance the operating budget in 28-29 will put more constraints on the government than would fiscal rules tied to change in the size of the economy." That's from Kevin Page, Madam Chair, which is saying that our fiscal anchor are solid. And as I've said, with respect to the Canada Strong Fund, my colleague is focusing on the cost, but she's not telling Canadians the benefit that they will derive from that because the government of Canada
Minister,
can borrow at one of
my
the lowest
question was
rates.
very clear. It was about the cost of the bureaucracy, just the number.
Well, Madam Chair, again, she should also say to Canadians that if you look at the cost of borrowing for the government of Canada, we're one of the lowest in the G7, which allows us
Minister,
to borrow at very favorable rate
Minister,
in order to invest.
You're the Minister of Finance. We're in the Finance Committee. We expect numbers to be discussed. So I asked about the cost of the bureaucracy. You're not giving it to me. What will the cost be for the executive salaries?
Madam Chair, again, I think Canadians want to hear about the benefit that the Canada Strong Fund will be doing. And I provide perspective to Canadians and saying Canada can borrow at one of the lowest costs in the G7. We'll invest in Canadian companies
in
and
this
projects
morning's
of national
report,
interest.
we have now heard that interest costs will, in fact, probably go up. The PBO report actually also noted that government operational costs were revised upwards another $18 billion, up to $142 billion. Was the interest payments for the Sovereign Wealth Fund factored into your government's operational
Thank you, Ms.
expenditures?
Cobena. That concludes your time. We will continue now with Mr. Hallan now for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, what is the definition of a recession?
Madam Chair, I think what my colleague, which I have a lot of respect for, is getting at is the economy, the Canadian economy resilient? And my response to him, I would say the Canadian economy is indeed resilient.
As the finance minister, I find it a little bit shocking. You don't know what the definition is. It's the widely accepted definition is 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. Would you agree with Friday's Stats Can report that Canada has had 2 consecutive GDP declining quarters? Yes or no?
Madam Chair, I think what my colleague is getting at, because I know he's looking at the data that came out, I think he will be comforted in his assessment by the OECD, which released numbers yesterday, which said that Canada would have the second fastest growth in the G7 for 2026 and 2027.
Statistics Canada, your own statistics agency, has said on Friday that Canada has had 2 consecutive quarters of GDP decline. Would you agree with that report, yes or no?
Madam Chair, I think that my colleague, when they read the report in more detail, they will see that there's some interesting element. We've seen business investment in machinery and equipment, which is up. We've seen business investment in intellectual property up.
Has declined for 5 straight quarters. But I'll move on, since obviously the finance minister of the country that helped to drive our economy into a recession refuses to answer. So it's very clear by the minister's own stats agency that Canada is in a recession now, a full-blown one. Can the minister tell us if any other G7 country is in a recession?
Madam Chair, again, my colleague will be happy to hear, in Canadians, because I know they're watching this morning, that the OECD yesterday just released numbers that shows again that Canada will have the second fastest growth in the G7